Welcome to today's webinar, everybody, Clinical Trials in Ataxia, Hope, Opportunity, and Caveats. Please note that all attendees are in listen-only mode and that this webinar is being recorded. I'm Lori Shogun, Community Program and Services Director for the National Ataxia Foundation. I'll be assisting with today's webinar along with our Communications Manager, Stephanie Lucas. Questions for the webinar speakers can be typed in the Questions tab found in your control panel. We will answer as many questions regarding this topic as time allows throughout the webinar and prior to the end time of today's session. So as your questions arise, please send those to us. Any unanswered or unrelated questions can be sent to naf@ataxia.org. We are so excited about where things are rapidly heading in ataxia research. Being able to present on the topic of clinical trials is a testament to these exciting times and the positive implications that the advances in research will have on the families affected by ataxia. The many patients that will participate in furthering these advances as research collaborators alongside the researchers and pharmaceutical companies are vital. We hope today's webinar will provide you with all the information about what clinical trials are and considerations in participating in clinical trials. Now I'd like to introduce you to the speakers for today's webinar. First, I'd like to introduce Ken Jones, who was formerly diagnosed with SCA2 about 4 years ago, although he became symptomatic in his 50s. Currently, Ken is participating in 2 ataxia studies, including a clinical research study of a drug being developed for the treatment of SCA. Next, I'd like to introduce Laura Ruggiero, who has 20 years of experience in pharmaceutical industry in the areas of medical, education, and clinical trial operations. She has led multiple clinical trials from phase 1 to 3. She is a senior clinical trial lead at Biohaven Pharmaceuticals with a primary focus on ataxia research. I'd like to introduce also Dr. Vikram Shakate, who is currently Associate Professor of Neurology, Molecular, and Integrative Physiology at the University of Michigan. He is also the Director of the Ataxia Clinic and the Associate Chair for Research for the Department of Neurology at the University of Michigan. He is the current Co-Director of the Clinical Research Consortium for the Study of Cerebellar Ataxia. Dr. Shakate will facilitate today's discussion. Laura Ruggiero will start off today's discussion about clinical trials. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Lori. Hi, everyone. Okay, so we could go to the next slide. Thanks, Lori. All right, so this will be a general overview of the drug development process, but if you or someone you know is thinking about participating in a clinical study, it's really helpful to understand the process and, more importantly, the different phases of a clinical trial in order to help you make an informed decision about participating. So the first step in drug development starts in a research lab where researchers are beginning to investigate a disease or a medical condition at the cellular level in order to understand how the disease develops in humans. And then once the researchers have a basic understanding of the underlying cause of the disease or condition, they begin to search for chemical compounds that could possibly target this process and then act on the pathways in the body that cause the disease. So researchers begin to look for molecules which could be used as a starting point for a new drug. They look to see if certain molecules could potentially stop or then reverse the development of a disease or condition. And at this point in the process, up to 10,000 molecules could potentially be studied. This investigation could take up to 3 to 5 years. And of those 10,000 molecules, only about 200 to 300 will have the potential to affect those specific pathways in the development of disease. Okay, and we could go on to the next slide. So once a compound is identified, they start testing that compound in phases. So the phases of the clinical trials are steps in which the scientists do experiments with a health intervention in an attempt to find enough evidence for a process which would be useful as a medical treatment. Each phase is designed to answer certain questions so that it could give accurate results about what the clinical trial is testing. So when I've polled friends or family about clinical trials involving investigational medication and asked them whether or not they would ever consider participating in a clinical trial, those who were skeptical about it always said something similar, and that was that they worry that clinical trials aren't safe. So by understanding and learning about the different phases of clinical trials, people could realize that each phase is really designed with the intention to help keep clinical safe. Next slide. So before a compound or a drug is tested in people, researchers must investigate the safety of the drug. So they need to look at possible side effects or toxicities by testing the drug both in computer models at the cellular level. This is usually called in vitro studies, as well as by studying the drug in animals, which is called in vivo studies. This stage of testing could take 1 to 2 years. And of the hundreds of drugs investigated during the preclinical testing, only about 2% move on to the next stage of drug development. So once a compound has passed the preclinical testing phase, investigators must submit an investigational new drug application, or sometimes called an IND, to the Food and Drug Administration before the drug to be tested in human volunteers. So this application must include all of the safety information collected in prior research, as well as a detailed description of the studies that are planned for human clinical trials. And the FDA will not let preclinical studies move into human trials without extensive data on safety. Next slide. So once an IND is approved, phase 1 trials may begin. So at this point, the compound has been put into some formulation for humans, so like a tablet or a capsule. And the study drug doesn't quite have a name yet at this point. It's usually referred to as a bunch of numbers or letters like AB623. I'm just making that up. But small doses of the study drug are then given to healthy human volunteers. So these studies may involve around 20 to 100 healthy volunteers, and they could last several months. So healthy volunteers play an important role in the future of drug development because before testing on participants who actually have a given condition, an investigational medication must be tested on healthy volunteers. So phase 1 studies are done to help identify an optimal dose and also to monitor the safety of the study drug. Phase 1 studies also gather information about how the drug is absorbed into the body, how long the drug's effects last, and any side effects. Now, during this time, the study volunteers are closely monitored as they receive the study drug, sometimes even staying overnight in research centers, so they're monitored. There may be several phase 1 studies on the same drug. Some may include a single ascending dose or a multiple ascending dose study. So what this means is the drug is given, the dose is gradually increased, and any side effects are closely monitored. So investigators may also explore how the drug behaves when given with food or with other medication, or they may see how the drug works in special populations like the elderly or those with liver or kidney impairment. So at this point in the process, approximately 70% of the drugs that are studied in phase 1 would move to the next phase. Next slide. Okay. So in phase 2 trials, the drug is tested in volunteers who have the disease or the condition for the drug that it's being developed to treat, for the condition that the drug is being developed to treat. These studies typically include several hundred patients and can take months to even years to complete. So during these studies, investigators are gathering information in order to help determine whether or not the drug works in the treatment of the disease or condition, to help confirm an effective dose, and to gather further information about the safety of the drug. So you also may hear the terms phase 2A or phase 2B studies. So what that means is during a phase 2A study, researchers are still looking to define an optimal dose and to gather some initial evidence that the drug is working the way it's intended to work. So sometimes these are called proof of concept studies. And then during a phase 2B study, researchers have determined a near final dose, and then they're further exploring to see if the drug is working the way they intended it to work. So at this point, approximately 33% of the drugs tested in phase 2 will move to the next phase. Next slide. Once a drug has demonstrated safety and effectiveness in a phase 2 trial, the drug is tested in a larger group, so hundreds to thousands of people, in order to further examine the effectiveness of the drug and its safety. These studies are designed to be longer in duration than the phase 2 studies, and that helps to provide more long-term safety data. So it can take up to 4 years to complete. These studies are often double-blind, and that means that neither the participants nor the researchers know who received the active drug. So in order to assess the effectiveness, information is collected from those participants in the study who are taking the drug and compared to the same information collected from participants taking the placebo. And a placebo is a substance that's designed to look like a study drug but contains no drug. Sometimes people call this a sugar pill. Approximately 25 to 30% of the drugs move to the next phase. Now, if a phase 3 study meets the study objectives, it's submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. And by this time in the research, the drug being investigated may actually have a name and will no longer be referred to those letters and numbers that it was in the earlier phases of testing. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about randomized versus non-randomized studies, because if you're interested in participating in a clinical study, you'll hear a lot of terms such as randomized or non-randomized or double-blind, controlled, placebo-controlled. So it's helpful to understand what these terms mean so you could decide if a particular study is right for you. So a non-randomized clinical trial is a study in which the participants are not assigned by chance to different treatment groups. So that means that the participants may be able to choose which group they want to be in, or they may be assigned to a group by the investigator. And this is typically done in studies where there's already an approved standard of care, so maybe oncology studies as an example. And at the time of the study, it's not known which treatment would be best. The benefit to that is the subject or the researchers select the treatment group. The disadvantage is that those two different groups are not very easily comparable. When drugs are being explored, especially in rare diseases or conditions, there's typically not a standard of care, so most of these studies will be randomized. And what that means is it's a study in which the participants are divided by chance, and this is usually done by a computer system, into separate groups that compare the different treatments. And using chance to divide people into groups means that the groups will be similar and the effects of the treatments they receive can be compared more fairly. So the benefits to a randomized study is that both arms, both active drug and placebo, can be compared fairly. The disadvantage would be that these studies are a little more difficult to recruit, especially when one study group is taking placebo. Next slide. So, as previously mentioned, if the drug has been proven to be safe and effective in phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, the investigator will submit a new drug application to the Food and Drug Administration. So, including phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, this stage of testing could take 6 to 7 years in total. So that's for all of those different phases, up to 7 years. And each phase often includes several different studies. So if a drug is granted approval, it becomes available for doctors to prescribe and on pharmacy shelves, but research doesn't stop there. So the drug will continue to be monitored for long-term safety in larger numbers of patients in phase 4 clinical trials. So phase 4 studies are done post-marketing, meaning that's after the FDA has approved the medicine. And these studies will include several thousand volunteers who have a disease or condition. And the main objective of the phase 4 study is to monitor the drug's performance in real-life scenarios in order to study the long-term risks and benefits and to discover any rare side effects. Next slide. So as you can see, it takes many years for a drug to become available to the public. So drug discovery is costly and requires scientific knowledge and a lot of dedication. And then again, also remember that the vast majority of those compounds tested in the beginning of drug development, they never make it to the final stages. So through careful testing and safe and effective drugs can be brought to market. And the regulations that make the process safe for patients require long-term studies and an adequate number of study volunteers, which is why study volunteers are really an invaluable and an integral part of the drug development process. So I will now pass it over to Dr. Shakate to talk about the next slide.
Phone is muted. Sorry. Thank you, Laura. That was a comprehensive review of the clinical trials process. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we think about ataxia trials, clinical trials in patients with ataxia. As you all know, ataxias are in general neurodegenerative disorders, at least the inherited ataxias. And it's helpful from a clinical trial design standpoint to think about whether the trial is designed to either improve symptoms or to modify the long-term course of disease or disease-modifying treatment. And this is a very important distinction practically, as I will talk about in the next couple of minutes. And a symptomatic agent would address the symptoms of ataxia, which include changes in speech, changes in gait, changes in coordination, and try and improve those symptoms. Whereas a neuroprotective or disease-modifying treatment would alter the long-term course by protecting neurons from cell death or degeneration. And although these are not mutually exclusive goals, it's nevertheless important from a trial design standpoint to know what the targeted endpoint is. For example, a symptomatic agent, trials for a symptomatic agent would be relatively short and maybe even weeks or months to know if improvements in clinical measures of symptom severity can be reduced in patients with ataxia. Whereas a neuroprotective or disease-modifying therapy would likely have to be a longer duration treatment to see if an agent can slow down the long-term course. And I want to highlight several things with these trial designs. One is in order to develop a neuroprotective or disease-modifying therapy, it is important to know what the natural history of disease is. For example, if the natural history of disease is unknown, it's very hard to know how a neuroprotective strategy or a neuroprotective trial can be designed. Hence, it is important for patients with ataxia to participate not just in therapy trials, but also in natural history studies to look at how disease evolves over time and to also know what patients feel are symptoms that affect them the most. I'm going to hand it back to Laura now to talk about participation in clinical trials.
Thank you. So again, clinical studies are not possible without study volunteers, and participation is important for a number of. So clinical trial participation is important because it helps to develop new technologies in medicine. So through clinical studies, researchers learn more about a disease or a condition and how that disease develops and responds to different treatment strategies. And with this knowledge, researchers are able to develop new and innovative treatments for a variety of medical conditions. And sometimes this knowledge guides the development of ways to even prevent the disease from developing, either through new ways of diagnosing the disease early or through preventative strategies, such as vaccines. So since most of the drugs for a given condition are only effective in a fraction of patients, understanding patient variability through advances in genetics and biomarkers helps to bring a more personalized approach to the current treatments. It also helps with disseminating scientific knowledge. So clinical research is designed so that the information is spread to the scientific and medical communities worldwide through conferences where scientists and clinicians gather to learn about clinical study results, or publications in scientific journals, which again are widespread, and knowledge is gained through clinical research studies. So even if a medication that's being studied in a clinical trial does not meet the objectives as planned, that information is really still critical for researchers to know, because it still provides clues that help the researchers move the field forward and design studies design different studies. So, and we've seen this happen with ataxia studies. It can improve health. So during clinical trials, only a few thousand participants may be able to gain access to a potentially beneficial medication or treatment. And then once the drug is approved by the FDA, access to that treatment becomes open to hundreds of thousands of millions of patients. So through the development of new ways to diagnose and prevent disease, as well as through the development of new medical treatments, research provides a huge benefit to society. So it can help by extending the survival for a variety of conditions and helps with disease prevention and early diagnosis. So it's strengthening our economy. So preventing disease and increasing the survival and improving the quality of life directly benefits the economy. So improving the health through disease prevention and treatment measures decreases the overall burden on the healthcare system. So as you see, by participating in clinical research, you really help advance the field of medicine. And as studies are completed and information is shared with the scientific community, that's when new treatments can become possible. So I will just pause and I will invite Mr. Jones to talk about his personal experience in participating in a clinical study.
Okay. As far as my personal experience, it actually has been kind of rewarding. Like I've enjoyed it. Like I thought I'd be the perfect candidate for the studies, since I have the SCA2, and like I said, I really look forward to the study team, and actually look forward to my visits, and hopefully like improving my like my exercises, like that I try it in front of my doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Now, Laura is going to tell us a little more about considerations about a trial, including how a protocol, what a study protocol is.
Okay, so we'll get into talking about inclusion and exclusion for clinical studies, but before that, I just wanted to share about, talk about what a protocol is, because I think this is helpful for folks to understand. So the protocol is a document that describes how a clinical trial will be conducted. So it provides the study objectives, the statistical consideration, basically the overall organization of a clinical study. And again, this is put in place to help ensure the safety of the volunteers participating as well. Plus, proper trial design is imperative because getting a drug approved requires substantial evidence that the drug will have a clinical benefit and that it's safe. So careful consideration is put into the study objectives and how we measure those objectives to show that the drug proves to have a clinically meaningful benefit, and that's what the FDA is looking for. It's critical that study participants meet specific criteria, and that helps to show whether or not the study drug is effective for a specific condition. So for rare disease, designing a study can be even trickier because there are not many studies that have previously occurred that people get to learn from. So in rare disease, natural history studies are very critical to the design of drug studies, because the natural history studies help us to define the patient population, the progression of the disease, which helps us determine things like how long the drug study will be. It helps select specific outcome measures. So in other words, what are the types of tests or questionnaires or lab tests that researchers are already using to help them understand the disease and the progression of the disease. So the FDA will also provide guidance on what they look for to support evidence that the drug could provide a clinically meaningful benefit. For example, can the drug help improve someone's activities of daily living, or daily activities? So knowing this, the protocol would include certain tests that could help us answer that question. Next slide. So protocols need to define a study population that makes it possible to accomplish the purpose of the study. So inclusion criteria are those characteristics that prospective study participants must have in order to be included in the study. So for example, they must have the specific condition being studied. So let's say a specific type of SCA. And then the exclusion criteria are those characteristics that would disqualify a prospective study participant from being included in the study. So for example, someone may have multiple medical conditions, and that might make it difficult to differentiate between the symptoms being caused by the disease being studied, or maybe those coexisting conditions. Or if someone is taking a medication, that could make it difficult to differentiate if the study drug would be having a benefit, or maybe another medication that the person's taking is providing that benefit. Or sometimes even certain medications can interact with the study drug. So for safety purposes, that person would not be able to be a good participant for the study. So you'll see, when clinical studies are being advertised, they typically provide a short list of this criteria. And then if you contact the research site about a particular study, they will go into more information about this criteria so that they can ensure that you're an appropriate candidate for participation. And again, I'll just stop here and I will ask Mr. Jones to also share his experience again. Thank you.
Well, since I already participate in other University of Michigan medical studies, I thought that I would be the perfect candidate for this drug study, as I meet one of the major requirements, having SCA2. So my initial inclination was to go ahead and participate and help with the drug study. My understanding of the drug study was that it had already been approved for other conditions, and the study was merely an increase in the dosage for Ataxia patients. So I thought the study was really low risk. I also feel really good about the medical care that I'm receiving from my doctor and the University of Michigan. And I wanted to say, as my conditions worsen, as I become more symptomatic, I'm probably going to be open to more riskier kind of drug studies too, to help me out.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. If we can advance the slide. So I think that brings up what is, and to take off from Mr. Jones' experience of participating in a trial, what does an individual participant need to consider when they participate in a trial? I think it is very important that participants really understand what the premise of the study is, and the whole role of the informed consent process that all clinical trials have to have is to get participants a clearer understanding of what the clinical trial is based on. And several things that are important for individual participants to consider is what is the premise, the biological premise of the agent. So in other words, what is the evidence that the agent actually can improve symptoms? Was it based on mouse models of disease? Was it based on human cell modeling? Or was it based on other laboratory studies? As Laura has already summarized previously, a clinical trial can only proceed in phases, and safety needs to be established in participants before it can be moved into more advanced phases for treatment effectiveness. But the biological premise of the agent under consideration is not an integral part of the safety part of the studies. So it's really important for participants themselves to consider what the premise is. the next important consideration is, what should a participant expect? Is this a study that is disease modifying, in which case they may not see any tangible improvements at all in symptoms, but overall, over a period of time, will slow progression, as opposed to a symptomatic study where there is a tangible improvement in symptoms. So it's important for participants to know what to expect from a study and consider that when they are participating in a study. And the final consideration is that of risk. So are all the known risks, are the risks known? I think the reason why the clinical trial process is often slow is that it's very important, before subjecting participants who already have neurologic issues to a significant risks to their safety. For example, in other phases of the study, is there an increased risk of mortality? Is there an increased risk of going to the emergency room with complications, for example? Or in patients with movement disorders like ataxia, can symptoms actually get worse due to the study medication? So these are important things for participants to consider, and it's important to go into a trial with your eyes open. And I think which I think the next slide really captures these considerations in participating in a clinical trial from Laura. Thanks.
Right, and definitely participating in a clinical study is not an easy decision. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank anybody who has participated in a research study. I mean, whether it be a natural history study or any other types of research, because that choice really does have an impact on the medical field. And really each volunteer counts. And so when you talk to study teams about participating in research, they will always review the risks and the benefits of participation. As Dr. Shakatai said, they'll review with you an informed consent form, and that form describes in very much detail what the study's about, what's involved, all the procedures and tests, how long it may be, and all the risks involved with participation. So many times when you volunteer for a study, there may be no direct benefit to you, but that participation can help researchers answer the questions to develop new treatments benefiting people in the future, which is important in genetic conditions like some ataxias. There may be adverse events associated with investigational medication, but those adverse events are outlined in the informed consent, the ones that we know of, right, because they've been reviewed in phase 1 and 2 studies. And because the participants are closely monitored, people have access to a full medical team and receive the medical care that they might not otherwise have. And this also gives people an opportunity to learn more about their condition and ask questions to a medical team of experts. Certainly participation in a study can be time consuming. So be sure to ask how many times you would have to visit a research site, because this could be difficult if you're in school or working or caring for someone. And many times participants may be reimbursed for time and travel. So always make sure to ask if you may be reimbursed for that. And it's also an important question if maybe the study is happening in a research site that's not in the same state as you. And you may have to travel if you're willing to do so. Again, while participation is voluntary and you could discontinue at any time, it really is important to ensure that enough volunteers complete the studies in order to provide enough data to support evidence of the success. And again, I will say, even if it doesn't meet its objectives, that's the data that's gathered from the study is so meaningful to the research community. And now, Dr. Shakatai, I'll hand it off to you to discuss how to know if a study is appropriate for someone.
Thank you, Laura. So before we go to the study appropriateness, I wanted to bring Mr. Jones back in and to talk about what he considered before he joined the trial that he's now participating in.
The first thing I really thought about was, should I participate in the trial? And basically, I decided to participate in the trial for several reasons. The first reason was the memory of my mother, who passed away from the complications related to SCA2. She didn't have the benefit of any drugs at all to help alleviate the symptoms. And I watched her as she progressed through the various stages. And having no drugs, like, I don't know how she coped. So I'm participating in the study to help identify a drug to help myself as well as others with ataxia. And then I have several other reasons. I have like 4 children and 3 grandchildren who may have SCA2, and I would like to be part of a drug study which will help them if they inherit ataxia.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. So we are now entering an era where from one clinical trial for ataxia, we will see almost certainly, as we know, there are other studies that are being planned for multiple studies in ataxia that potentially may be happening in parallel. So from a participant standpoint, how do you decide which study is most appropriate for you? The inclusion and exclusion criteria will help determine who's eligible for some studies. For some studies may require patients with ataxia to have specific genotypes, may have a specific stage in disease, and those may be the consideration for participation. But if a participant is eligible for more than one study, how can you make an informed decision? And I think this is where the trial site is very important. So the experience of the investigator who is conducting the trial at an individual site, it's their responsibility to know which studies are out there. And it's important for them to consider the participants' best interest in fully disclosing all the details of all the studies. And sometimes having an investigator who has experience in ataxia is therefore relevant to participating in clinical trials as well. Next slide, please. Laura?
Thank you. So this slide has a couple of resources. So if you want to find out more about how clinical trials work, the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation has some great information about participating in clinical studies. And then the National Institutes of Health also has some information. So if you go on their site and you could search clinical research trials, some good information comes up. And then, if you're looking to find out what clinical trials are available for your particular condition, certainly first talk to your physician, your healthcare team. There are many academic research centers that are running studies. And again, it's important to look for, in the field of ataxia clinics or movement disorder clinics. Certainly advocacy organizations like NAF, who are wonderful about, spreading information about clinical trial participation, the studies that are currently ongoing or maybe upcoming, and also patient registries, because they allow you to opt in to find out more about any upcoming clinical studies for your condition. And then also clinicaltrials.gov. So companies are required to post their research studies on clinicaltrials.gov. And I did want to address part of a question. Clinicaltrials.gov in the U.S. also requires you to provide some study results once a study has ended. So I know a lot of people do wonder, I've participated in a study, how do I know what happened? So that site does now have information about some of the results of the clinical studies.
Thank you, Laura. So this is information about the patient registry. The NAF website at www.ataxia.org has information about industry-sponsored as well as natural history and other biomarker studies for ataxia. I think enrolling in a patient registry can help identify you to investigators, both in industry who ultimately can do access the site, as well as research institutions who are interested in conducting trials on patients with ataxia.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken, Laura, and Dr. Shakate for all that helpful information that you've shared today about clinical trials. And as Dr. Shakate mentioned, the CORDS registry, if you have not already registered, please consider joining the CORDS registry. That registry is an important recruitment tool for ataxia research studies and clinical trials. Also, please check the research section of NAF's website often, as information about recruiting studies and trials is updated often there. We're now going to begin answering questions that you have submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions through your control panel. And I just had a question for Ken. Ken, how did you hear about the clinical trial that you are currently participating in?
Well, I learned about it through interactions with my doctor, who and I think that's like one of the ways the word kind of gets out to patients is by working with your doctor, and that's how I heard about it.
Thank you. Dr. Shakate, would you like to answer any questions that you have received through the webinar?
So I have a number of questions. Maybe I'll answer several of these, and then maybe have Laura and Ken answer some of their questions. So I'm going to read out the questions that I have received in order. So the first question is, this has affected several of my family members. I have a daughter who's 22. Should she be tested? So at this point, we don't have approved treatment options for ataxia. I'm assuming that the person who asked this question has a known genetic diagnosis of ataxia. So if I'm interpreting this question to mean that in an asymptomatic person, should testing be performed? At this point, since we don't have either disease-modifying or approved symptomatic agents for ataxia, the value of testing in an asymptomatic individual for clinical purposes is really a very personal decision. What can guide whether somebody wants to test in a asymptomatic individual is whether they are considering having a family, and whether they are considering whether or not that they would want to pass on their known genetic cause of ataxia to their children. And with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is a technique using in vitro fertilization, you can screen embryos for specific forms of inherited ataxia, and that would be a reason to potentially test in an asymptomatic individual. There are research considerations for testing in asymptomatic individuals, and there is an NIH-sponsored study that is ongoing, known as READY-SCA, for individuals with SCA1 and SCA3 who are currently asymptomatic, but this testing would be done in a research laboratory, and the test results need not be divulged. It's up to the participant whether they would be divulged back to the participant. And this is to know what the natural history of evolution from an asymptomatic status to a symptomatic status, how it occurs. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. But in an asymptomatic individual, testing has pluses and minuses, and it's really important to talk to your physician about what the benefits and risks are of testing. In a symptomatic individual, I think knowing the genetic diagnosis, it can be very valuable. And the reason is that it can tell you about long-term prognosis, and it can help considering whether you want to participate in a specific clinical trial. And that segues into the next question, which is, in order to participate in clinical trials, do I need to know what type of ataxia you have? I have, and how do I do that? So the current trial for ataxia, as well as future trials, many of them will require a specific genetic diagnosis, often either SCA or a recessive ataxia, for example, Friedreich ataxia. And knowing the genetic status of the ataxia would be essential for participation in trials. And how one finds out about the genetic form of ataxia is ataxia can be due to many different causes. Many of them are genetic, but there are also many other causes for ataxia. And I think seeing a neurologist who really has expertise in ataxia will help make that diagnosis. And the way to make a diagnosis of a genetic or inherited form of ataxia is through genetic testing, which is using DNA in the blood to look at which specific genes have mutations or abnormalities that would explain the ataxia. And I'll answer one more question and then hand off to Laura. So this appears to be late for my wife. She is into this 13 years, walking, speech, and a lot of other conditions. So what do you have for her in this condition? I think the question is, the question being asked is, with advanced stage disease, are there clinical trials that could potentially help? And it's hard to know for certain, but agents that improve symptoms may potentially be able to help at least some symptoms, depending on how advanced disease is and what specific symptoms are most impairing. And other studies, including disease-modifying studies, this individual may be able to participate really to know whether the target is being engaged, meaning if there's a mutant protein that needs to be reduced, whether this agent that's being developed is actually targeting that and reducing levels. So I think it's important to, it's impossible to predict what the inclusion and exclusion criteria of an individual trial are, but there's potential opportunities for patients with all stages of ataxia to participate in clinical trials. Laura?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. I wasn't sure if you wanted to do. I have several more questions, but if you wanted to do some of your questions, and then I can come back to some of my others.
All right. So let's see. I'm just going to go through the questions here. One moment. So there's a question about the percentage of drugs that go into phase 4. So once a drug is approved to go to market, phase 4 studies will still occur. So remember, these are the phase 4 studies happen in drugs that are already approved by the FDA. And all of the drugs will continue to go through some studies, again, to monitor the long-term safety and see if any other adverse events occur that they weren't seeing in the previous clinical trials. And at this point, too, some drugs are continuing to be studied potentially for other indications. But again, those phase 4 studies are really long-term safety studies. Another question is, what are the criteria that the FDA uses to actually approve a drug? So, in general, when an investigational new drug application is submitted to the FDA, they will review that and come back with some questions. Now, again, remember that IND, that IND needs to include the preclinical work as well as what some of the planned studies are for human volunteers. So the FDA may come back and provide some guidance. There are regulatory specialists that submit all that documentation to the FDA, so they know all of that criteria that they're looking for. And certainly the FDA also provides guidance to companies that help them build the protocols. So I hope that answers some of that question.
Mr. Jones, do you have any questions? Oh, actually, I have a question for Mr. Jones. So there's Mr. Jones, just like Mr. Jones, this individual has a son in his 20s. He's now 32, and he can no longer speak or control movements. And the trial that the individual has seen is mostly on the ability to walk independently and ability to communicate. The question is, will there be future studies? And the question for Mr. Jones is, if there are advanced symptoms like this, might he have considered participation?
Yeah, with the advanced symptoms, I guess I'd probably be more inclined to participate because as the quality of life kind of deteriorates, it's going to be kind of I guess I'll be open to riskier studies than what I'm in. I think I'm in a pretty low risk study. But as the disease progresses, I'll be open to getting in more high risk studies.
So I'm going to answer several other questions. Do patients who participate in the natural history study have priority to participate in clinical trials? So while I think it's important to think about these studies separately, it is true that patients who are in natural history studies or in registries are more accessible to investigators for participation in intervention trials. I don't know that there is any greater priority for patients, but I think their knowledge about clinical trials and access to clinical trials will be higher if they're also participating in other studies, such as natural history studies. The next question is, and this is also relates to Mr. Jones and the reason why he participated in a trial. The question is, I have always been of the mindset, while there is little or nothing I can do for my ataxia, I would like to do what I can to help future generations. Specifically, I'd like to participate in studies as much as possible. What can I do to make sure I'm asked? So I'm going to let Mr. Jones respond because he has personally gone through this when told about a clinical trial.
Yeah, well, as far as what can I do to help, I'm of the same mindset. Like I would like to help out, like a lot, help myself and as well as help future generations and my children and grandchildren. But I guess I wrote down to www.ataxia.org, and to make sure that I'm registered. And like I said before, like my relationship with my doctor really has helped me get involved in studies. So that was how I got involved, through my doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Another question for me is, do you see in the near future if there will be a clinical study in SCA 28 or other SCAs that are currently not eligible? And the way I would answer this question is, unless you have a specific genetic diagnosis, it's hard for researchers to develop therapies targeted towards that specific mechanism. There are other therapies, for example, symptomatic agents that are potentially coming down the pike, where it may not be important to have a specific form of ataxia, and it may be symptom-based. So although there are no specific studies directed towards SCA 28 at this point, I foresee that at least trials of symptomatic agents where there are shared mechanisms of dysfunction in the cerebellum, those could be targeted by studies where the exact genetic cause may not be an important consideration. Several other questions. How can I increase my odds to participate in a clinical trial? And I think Mr. Jones answered some of this, and Laura Ruggiero answered some of this. So I think being well connected to the ataxia community, having a neurologist or obtaining care with an investigator who also is familiar or is involved in clinical trials, and signing up for ataxia registries. I think all these would be ways for you to inform yourself about ataxia trials. The next question is, I have cerebellar ataxia diagnosed a year and a half ago. I live far away from Michigan. Is it too far for me to participate? I'll let Laura answer this, because I think Biohaven, for example, has made it possible for patients anywhere in the United States to find an appropriate site for participation. Laura?
Right, that's correct. So, I would encourage you to call a site that's closest to you. And if people are willing to travel, especially with spinocerebellar ataxia and ataxia in general, there really are very few specialists and not so many research sites that are available to do this study. So, we wish there were more available in certain parts of the country, but that is why we will fund, or reimburse for travel if people are willing to go to, another state or travel a few hours away to be in the study. So certainly ask. Mm-hmm.
And then the next question is, do you know what clinical trials are coming for ataxia? So I can only speak about trials and trial information that's publicly available, and Laura, you may be able to comment as well. There are several drug companies that in their pipeline have indicated that ataxia is something that they are interested in. We do anticipate that disease-modifying therapies with antisense oligonucleotides are likely in development, and this is really based on published studies from several different university labs in mouse models of ataxia with a collaborator in industry, Ionis Pharmaceuticals, that has already taken an antisense oligonucleotide into clinical trials in a different disease, but with a similar mechanism as some of the ataxias known as Huntington's disease. So we fully anticipate that disease-modifying therapies are likely in development, but I can't speak to more specifics than that, other than what I know from the published information. We also know, based on some orphan drug indication filings with the FDA, that there are several other companies that are have an interest, at least, in developing symptomatic agents for ataxia, and we anticipate that some of those trials will start enrolling at some point in the near future. Yeah. Laura, do you have additional comments?
Sure. So I would just add, again, clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource, and usually studies are posted very close to, when they would be able to begin enrolling. So while there may be studies that are still in the planning stage and may not be on clinicaltrials.gov yet, again, it's a good resource to keep looking at. And then, certainly the NAF meetings and advocacy organizations, are wonderful resources, and many of the pharmaceutical companies have worked with NAF very closely and share information, what they can, for upcoming trials.
And I think we're over time, but I have one last question. Does walking ever improve? I guess this is a difficult question to answer. I mean, is in the context of a clinical trial, I think one of the endpoints that we would like to see have improvements in is walking. And I think both the ataxia rating scale that we use to measure ataxia, gait is a really important component, and ongoing clinical studies in ataxia have really focused on gait as an important endpoint. So that is clearly something that we know is important for patients with ataxia, and that the FDA recognizes as an important clinical trial endpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Shakate. Great questions, everyone. That is all we have time for today. A recording of today's webinar will be made available, and additional questions can be sent to naf@ataxia.org. Thank you again to our presenters and staff that contributed to this webinar. We truly appreciate all of you for joining us for today's webinar. Please